Great to meet everybody here. Let me just make sure my mic is okay. Cool. Yeah, great to meet everybody here. I've been following, trying to get up to speed on the autonomous world stuff, so I was excited to join and learn more. I might have some of my own questions. My background, I'm now considered a games person. So I started. I'm one of the founders of Zynga, which was recently acquired by Take-Two. So ended up being a mobile game company. But what we're sort of famous for is before that, creating the idea of social games and sort of a lot of the freemium business model outside of Asia. And so, my background is just kind of early consumer product, thinking about growth and how to solve the business model problem. So I've also been investing after I left Zynga. So I've invested in like 120 companies. Some are Web3, some are Web2, and most of them aren't in games. And so the way I like to think of myself is more of like a startup consumer internet person. And when it comes to games, I've just like to focus on the places that kind of have unsolved, new, exciting frontiers. So excited to chat more with you guys today.
Yeah. So I think most of you know me already. I'm Raf. I'm at Lattice, and I've been making games for 20 years. Ubisoft, CCP. Then I moved to Dapper. Funny enough, Justin was an advisor for Dapper, and we would talk regularly for over a year. And even last time, I think, was when he was starting Playco, which was a very, very interesting time. So I couldn't be happier to be able to talk to him again and chat about all this weird stuff, because as an advisor and now actually as a player in the crypto space. So happy to have you here, Justin, with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So I would like you to start by that, right? Like you did Zynga, you did the investing and all that. So, and then you had Playco and now Storyverse. How is that going? What do you see in crypto? How do you see the opportunities, and why, as you said, like the unexplored frontiers of tech consumer product? What is getting you interested in all this?
Yeah, I mean, I grew up on the internet, right? And so back when I was a kid, we were starting to see like the earliest days of things I would play around with were these in AOL chat, okay? And like making, there were chat rooms where people would like basically play games that were powered by chat together, and people would write bots to do this, right? It's happened in IRC as well. So sort of the earliest days of mobile of games for me were in those spaces, and they were sort of inherently social. So I spent a lot of time fascinated with that. And a lot of the things that I got excited about was always building on from the beginnings, building on the bases that somebody else had already put together. So you can imagine, like, as a 12-year-old kid using Visual Basic, you can't do much, right? But if you're integrating with AOL Instant Messenger, suddenly you can go build a game inside of a chat room and everyone can play it immediately. So that was something that really definitely hit me early, and ended up being something that I worked on for a long time. And did that on MySpace. They had like similar exploits for you to inject JavaScript into the page they accidentally didn't patch, and that was a thing before they had official APIs. And then naturally, when Facebook came out with APIs, it was something the first day that there were apps available or APIs available for developers, I released an app that was related to games. And so I've always thought it's just very interesting to be able to build something on the shoulders of giants, and to not have to do the groundwork of building something that takes years of investment and to leverage it. And so I think it's pretty clear to see that through line to crypto, where the interoperability, for the first time, everything is sort of accessible by default, right? And so that's probably the thing that gets me the most excited is as a game developer, you work on a lot of things that don't end up seeing the light of day, or that they're out for a few years and they shut down. And it always struck me just like how much code was out there that was amazing, and that how much product was out there that people worked on that had so much good in it, but then just got shut off. And I think one of the really cool things about where we're headed is that may not be the case, right? There may be a lot of ways for people to interact with the projects that people have created, and we'll get to something bigger and more interesting because of it. So that's probably one thing that got me focused on it. The other one was just ownership, right? So I've worked on some virtual worlds where they had huge trading economies. At one point, we had 7 million daily active players on this game at Zynga, where people were trading items. They were middle-aged women, so they weren't like hardcore game players, but they were trading items all day. And so I thought a lot about like this whole idea of virtual goods and trading economies and things like that. And people started reaching out to me pretty early in the NFT days about this space and just asking like, what do you think about this? Because it seems like virtual goods. And for me, I mean, the leap to from virtual goods to NFTs is really small. Like all the psychology around why people play games and buy things that are just digital goods applies in NFTs. Most of the reasons are the same. It just opens up even more new use cases. And so I didn't need much convincing on that. And like you mentioned, when it came to advising Dapper and stuff, it was just like, I wanted to learn as much from the team as I could contribute on the game side. So it was no brainer for me to just get up to speed on what was going on in the space and to learn along the way. I think that this space it's been overhyped in many ways, right, with games. And I think it's weird to be in a space where the promise, I think we're so excited about what it can become, and we've been wrong about what that might be probably multiple times now. But I'm even more bullish than I was 4 or 5 years ago. I just feel like the space is maturing in ways that to me are exciting. Like I'm starting to see communities like this pop up, and there's a lot of initiatives now where like you're seeing real IPs start to get formed on the chain, and you're actually starting to see the promise of this like interoperability play out. So yeah, it may not be the metaverse that we thought it was last year, but I think there's a lot of really cool stuff going on.
Yeah. Oh my God. Technology being overhyped, right? Who ever heard of that? So one point that I think is really interesting that you mentioned before about like business models and stuff is that like Zynga was the biggest company on the free-to-play era, right? Like what Zynga did, it kind of changed the way games are made. Game design now becomes this, especially on the freemium / free-to-play model, right? Towards microtransactions, you have D1s, D7, D30s, you have all these numbers you do by KPI, which is something that this kind of discipline and of product-driven design didn't exist before when we were doing like console games and all that. Tell us about how much the business model defines the game design, because I think that is really, really something that people don't talk about much, because when you design the game for an arcade, for a console, for mobile, those are completely different games. And the game itself, the gameplay, everything you do has to fit that business model. And as we know the past, what do you think could be the possibilities? Of course, nobody has the answer now. Well, if you do, please give us, but I don't think you do. But how do you see this playing out in this new space?
Yeah, it's I'm just as interested to know as everybody else. But I guess one thing that I think is easy to forget in this space is that we're sort of competing with each other within some of these chains and ecosystems, and then some of the chains are also competing with other chains. And then I think this is the part that people often forget. You're also competing with all the non-blockchain content and ecosystem. And I think this is especially true within games, because there are a lot of places you can get entertainment today that aren't blockchain related. And there aren't necessarily a lot of people who are asking for blockchain, right? So there are some people who are, and for them, like blockchain is a future, but for the majority of the people just seeking entertainment, it's not. And so I think that that's something that like ends up being pretty important when you think about what you're up against and what it takes. Like, why did people play social games, for example, right? They were free, and games before that largely weren't free. And actually, it's interesting because if you ask console gamers what they thought of what we were doing, they would constantly say like, it's a ripoff. You have to pay for stuff in the game, but they'd ignore the fact they spent $50 on the game up front. It was this really strange thing where like they felt like freemium was a worse value because they were so used to getting their content for $50 up front that it didn't occur to them that they were actually spending money to play the game before they even knew what it was. And so for us, like we used to talk about this graph of like the trend of cost of entertainment going down over time. And what a lot of people don't know, a lot of people in the industry know this, but a lot of people outside the industry don't know it, is that that games are the cheapest form of entertainment that's out there by a long shot. And that's a big part of the story over the last 20 years from freemium and everything else. And even before freemium, with console games, games were a very cheap form of entertainment, like per hour dollar costs relative to movies and all this other entertainment. It's always been one of the cheapest and best. And so I think the question for us is like in blockchain, where so much of it is focused on the value sort of created and grown, how do you balance the reality that people have a lot of good and cheap options, and that a big part of the macro growth over the last 20 years is about being a cheaper and better option. And so I don't have the answers for that, but I think that's got to be part of the story. If you think about mass market gaming, it's hard to divorce free from what the gaming market has become to some extent, and that's become an expectation. And there are people out there that will pay for content. So I'm not suggesting that they don't exist, but it's an increasingly small portion of the overall market. And so I think part of the trick is going to be figuring out how to work with people who are in that sort of mindset where they're expecting to get free content, and see if there are ways to have them to be part of these ecosystems that's meaningful, but maybe not the same full experience. And that was what a lot of freemium was about, which was like, okay, you may have 10 million players and 100,000 or a few 100,000 are actually spending money, and the rest are just sort of playing the game for free. Maybe they're spreading it to their friends. And so this is something I would like to see more thinking around, which is like, how do we create large free economies where we're not so strict on what these people are doing that interact with these games in a meaningful way?
Yeah, that is interesting, because when we think about blockchain, and specific like the entertainment side of blockchain, that's a lot of NFTs and stuff like that. Usually that stuff is very, very expensive. It's on the opposite side, right? It's not about free at all.
Yeah. And that seems to be what's driven the narrative for the last few years, right? So I think that's the tricky part. And then I also feel like with the metaverse stuff, we jumped toward this model that was kind of this landlord rent seeking model, where it felt almost some ways regressive, in the sense that like you're going from a company being the one that's making the money to having many interested stakeholders who think that they should be now getting paid. And the problem is just like on the incentive is you still have to win that player, right? In the sense that you still have to win that player from all the other games that aren't forcing this economic model on this person who's just looking to be entertained. And so unless you can come up with a game that uses, of course, the blockchain, we hope it uses it in like a unique way that drives more interesting value that they can't get from the non-blockchain game, which I do think is probably going to be key here. It's a difficult place to start, right? Like we saw in a lot of these metaverses, suddenly like you can go create in Minecraft for free, or you can go play the blockchain version and have to spend thousands of dollars or pay somebody to rent their land. To me, that doesn't seem like a model that works. But that's why I like that, at least now with where the market is at, like people are starting to be a little bit more open-minded about exploring models that don't approach it that way.
Yeah, I think the SEC is also helping everybody think differently, not too much as stakeholders, because it's a big slap in the fingers. There's one point too that I would like you to talk about a little bit, especially from your experience in the past with Zynga and with the benefits that blockchain brings, is the notion of platform risk, right? Because Zynga, the relationship with Facebook, created lots of friction, to say the least, and how the social graph was like really important for the games itself, for the way the games grew. And then that platform risk is something that in the blockchain, it can be mitigated, right? So if you can tell us about a little bit what happened and how you see this new space.
Yeah, it can. Yeah, it's interesting. It can be mitigated, and then there's a new type of risk, which is like there's sort of all these counterparties that exist on the blockchain that also can have like pretty big effects on the economics. And I think we just saw that with Blur. So I guess the way I would think about it is like even Apple has rugged developers over the last couple of years with the IDFA changes. So if you look at what happened with the mobile game industry, it grew through targeted advertising. It wasn't what we did on social games where we were growing games through your friends, playing and sharing together. It was mostly performance marketing, and most of that performance marketing was going through Facebook's channels, which is interesting considering, you know, Apple runs the App Store. They take a 30% cut. They say it's mostly for discovery, but they're responsible for like fewer than 10% of all app installs. So they don't really help anyone get their game discovered. And a lot of the app installs they are responsible for are people who are coming and searching your app name that learned it somewhere else. So still not really discovery. The challenge is like, you know, just like Apple's change with IDFA, they don't allow the tracking that people need to advertise precisely anymore. Now, a lot of people have figured out a way around that. And many people who are in the game industry also understand that like now the new fingerprinting that a lot of companies have done to get around the IDFA ban, or just IDFA being turned off, it is also now going to be disabled over the next few months. So we saw mobile game revenue down for the first time in 15 years this year. And I think next year might also be a down year. I'm not going to trade on it or anything. That's not my space, but I do think there's like if Apple follows through with what they say they're going to do, it's going to be another down year. And I think from that perspective, like every platform carries risks, right? And with Facebook for us, actually the thing that hurt us the most was the shift. And we had our games on desktop social on Facebook, and it turned out Facebook's users moved to iPhones and Androids faster than anyone thought, including Facebook. And that when they moved, they quit using the desktop Facebook, which is not something that people thought would be the case, actually. And because it cannibalized so quickly, the mobile market was not big enough for us to like make the revenue back that we were declining from desktop. So we're making like $1 billion a year on desktop, and the mobile game market was like 100 million or a couple 100 million or something, right? So no matter how well we did on mobile, we couldn't grow it fast enough to make up for the revenue that of a declining desktop that was happening very quickly. And so anyway, I think what's going on with Ethereum is like this still happens, but it happens in a way more complex way, which when you think about Blur, I'm a big fan of Gabe Layden and what he's been doing with Limit Break. And what he did with free NFTs was interesting because the model worked. And so I know it's not that what I think Blur did was wrong. It's a really good example of how you can have a business model that worked one week and then it didn't work the next. And it could have been predictable in some way to be able to say, okay, well, of course, royalties aren't baked in at the smart contract level. So it's always possible for someone to stop giving creators royalties. But he had a very successful business model in giving people a bunch of free NFTs, which is a great way to grow the space, a great way to grow a project. And he was making revenue from the secondaries just like everybody else. And then Blur and accelerated this change that maybe was inevitable, but they certainly accelerated it. And then that leaves that project in a really hard situation. Never mind the other sort of, I don't know exactly how many NFT projects are dead because of that move, but it's got to be the majority, right? And many of them maybe weren't using the funds in particularly useful ways, but a lot of them were. And so that's a total business model shift on a greater scale probably than what I've seen on like mobile and Facebook, because in that sense, like Blur doesn't care. And I think that the problem in that situation is like the DApp developers or the NFT developers, they didn't have a seat at the table. In the sense that like you have platforms and you have traders who have a seat at the table, but then no one's asking like, well, what keeps the developer afloat? And so even if it was inevitable, if you just consider these two parties, the challenge is it doesn't mean it's necessarily the best for Ethereum. It doesn't necessarily mean it's the best for developers. And so to me, I think there's probably more of those situations, and I guess like it just takes a little bit more thinking further out and game theory in terms of how this is going to pan out. I know a lot of people thought about this with DeFi and other things, but it's been tricky to sort of, even if people knew that, I think there aren't a lot of people who actually understood the time frame that would happen on NFTs, and certainly most projects got blindsided by it. So still happens.
Yeah, I think that is really the danger doesn't come from below. The danger comes from the top mainly, because even though the platform is free and safe and established and everybody's in the same playing field, people can come and basically steal your lunch, because that's what happened to a certain extent. I think Jay has a question about OG face. Jay, do you want to ask it? Just go ahead.
Hi, Justin. I've got a question about I guess the peak period of Zynga, and because the original currency that everyone was buying to be able to transact with the games was Facebook coins, like back in the day, and Facebook killed that as a digital currency really early on, and that was pre the I think it was 2014 when they issued the first digital currencies guidance. But yeah, I was just wondering if you just talk a bit about that and the experience of like Facebook having a in-world currency and having to use that as your sort of like financial on-ramp.
Yeah, it wasn't great because they didn't know that games would be a thing on their platform when they launched it. So you can go back and you can watch the original F8 keynote where Zuckerberg announced the APIs, and it was a big deal when he announced it. But games were not in the list. It was like social calendaring and all this other. They were really, it's funny, their metaphor was Microsoft at the time. Actually, Facebook had a very close relationship with Microsoft, and their inspiration for doing a platform was what happened with Windows. And if you go and watch the original keynote, like that'll be really clear. It wasn't what the app, it actually ended up becoming like a precursor to the Apple's iOS app ecosystem in terms of what types of stuff got developed. But no one had seen that before. So it wasn't really what people expected. It was a bunch of social apps and games. And so they weren't prepared for microtransactions. It wasn't a thing. So we just rolled our own credit card payments processing. And this is back when, in order to do that, like there was PayPal for eBay, and then there was credit card processors for adult websites. So like literally the first time I wrote currency transactions on poker or on Facebook, we were using a credit card processor for adult websites because they were the only ones that had the APIs that we could use to deal with fraud, because virtual currency transactions were not a thing. And the problem is we got really good at it. So like we had like a 30-person team internally that just did this, just built payments and fraud and all that technology. And Facebook had no idea how much money we were making because we were processing all the payments by ourselves. And so it got to this point where we were making hundreds of millions of dollars, and Facebook had no idea. They thought we were making like a couple $1,000,000 here and there. They could see the ad stuff happening, but they couldn't see what was happening on the microtransaction side. And so that's when they decided we need to have our own currency and you need to use it. And we said, sure. But we were also their largest advertiser at the time. They had an ad platform and they wanted to IPO. And we were IPOing at the same time. We IPO'd a month apart. And in their S1, it ended up being that they had to disclose that we were 70% of their ad revenue at the time they IPO'd, which is kind of insane when you think about it. Like, think about the behemoth that Facebook has become. And when they IPO'd, they had a lot of revenue, but almost all of it was from us. And that was, we were paying them because we wanted to align incentives. So we were actually growing a lot more outside of their ad ecosystem. Their desktop ad ecosystem wasn't that great. But we were throwing the extra profit in anyway, because we didn't like the idea that Facebook wouldn't make enough money from what we were doing. And the credits thing wasn't working because they could never get their currency that you mentioned to really function as well on the fraud side. And there were a lot of problems with like how you do accounting across games that they ran into, where basically like games were getting, developers were saying, hey, if I'm the person who gets someone to put in their credit card, I should get some credit for that. And especially we were saying that, right? Because like 90% of the people who are playing games in the site put their credit cards into the site to spend money on Farmville, not on Facebook coins. And so then later there'd be less friction. They go play another game. Now they can just go use their stored credit card or something. And so there was a lot of fighting about like who gets credit for who is the one that actually converted the user to a buyer. Because once they're a buyer, then they're more likely to spend everywhere else. And then there was a lot of fighting about fraud, and Facebook didn't really, they kind of had like a B team on it. And so like their fraud detection was never very good. And so we would run A/B tests with ours versus theirs and we said, sure, we'll use it on everything once it functions as well, but it never really quite got there. So they had a lot of trouble getting everybody to use it that actually had volume. So like the few biggest developers. And then what happened is mobile came, and Apple basically told them, like, you can't do that on the app. And so that was pretty much what ended up killing it. They did try to roll actually Facebook was aligned with us. They tried to do a mobile app platform that was mobile web. So like we tried to do a version of Farmville you could play inside of their iOS app, and then Apple killed it. This is back in like 2011 or something. It was a long time ago. It's called Project Spartan. You can look it up. They were a little too aggressive. They told TechCrunch they were going to kill Apple's app store, and then Apple just said, turns out that's against policy, and then it got shut off.
Thanks very much. That was super interesting.
Yeah, it was. That's so interesting when the big ones fight. So to go back to the metaverse and the crypto world, you mentioned that we don't know what metaverse, whatever you want to call this new space that's going to flourish. How do you see, what do you think is going to be the most important? Because there are basically two factors there, right? There is a value transfer layer where you have the ownership and all that you mentioned. And on the other side, you have this potential platform for content creators. How do you see alignment and how do you allow these content creators to flourish? What do you think are the formats? What is good at now? And what would be the next kind of adjacent circle that you see that people are pushing towards that would be the most interesting ones?
Yeah, I think it's been a continuation of this trend of having more people able to create, right? I think in blockchain, it's almost like I don't know the right way of describing it, but it's almost like a digital printing press or factory of some sort, right? Where before, if you wanted to make virtual goods, you had to work at a game company and build a game and then put the items inside of it. And now suddenly everybody can make these virtual items on the internet within any context they want. And so if you look at it from that framework, like, yeah, virtual goods were like this, or mobile games, $130 billion a year industry. Of course, NFTs are such a big deal because suddenly anyone can make a virtual item. And before it was just those game people. When it comes to like what that ends up being in the metaverse, I think that's exactly the point, is like, if someone can dream up a costume or, a hat or whatever, I think there's going to be a market for that. There's a lot of work that has to be done on standards though. And I think that's super hard. And there's been a mixture of companies in terms of the way they're trying to capture value. So I just feel like that's where it may just take a lot of time. And so I'm hopeful, like, and I think on the digital fashion side, like, that'll get sorted out. I like this idea that people can kind of jump from space to space. The name of some of these products is it's slipping my mind right now, but there are some that connect, like, for example, on Cyber to Decentraland to Sandbox. They can create these portals from space to space. I think that's really interesting, because I think a lot of people aren't going to care as long as these products load in instantly without a download, depending on how they're architected. Like, I think people are going to be fine with going from space to space. I think there's been a really tight focus on the metaverse meeting live, though, which is it's really hard to get live games right. There's a really big critical mass problem. And if you look at like the most successful social products, they're almost entirely asynchronous. And it's to solve this problem. It's not that Facebook can't go and build a live homepage. It's just that if they do, you're probably not going to like it. It's just a fact that, like, asynchronous communication is a better experience for a lot of people when it comes to just having the right, like, network density of people there. And I think we've all had this experience of jumping into these virtual worlds or metaverses where there's just no one there, or the people that are there aren't the people that you want to be there. And asynchronous sort of solves this problem. So I'm still I think a lot of projects have been so attached to that idea. And I think if you look at what happened with virtual worlds, it was really like it was the ones that could be a little bit less religious about that ended up starting to make traction, where like maybe you can blur the two. And so to me, that's not really inside of the idea of like necessarily the blockchain design space, but it is related to how much most projects are approaching this in a way that I think is making it a lot harder for them to succeed. Especially when you think about there's just not enough people in the space. Like what if Decentraland or what if Sandbox or some of these spaces were more asynchronous? Like we could all and there was like a way for me to play and then you guys could show up and you could play your turn or your piece or see what I did. It would probably be something that I would actually use more often. But I think the live nature holds it back right now. So when it comes to ownership, I'm excited about like all of the utilities that we haven't thought of yet. So like the sort of dressing up is the obvious one I mentioned, but I really like this idea that like, Ford sold cars and then somebody else could be the tire company and somebody else could be the mechanic. And then somebody could start Uber and make it so that you drive cars around to go deliver things. And it's that sort of way of thinking to me that's like really interesting with NFTs, where I think if hopefully some of these things end up having, a number of utilities and a number of uses in the ecosystem that we're just not even able to imagine yet. So I personally like that's probably the part that I think is most exciting right now.
Yeah, these ancillary services, right, that derive from the original one is actually like they cut both ways too, as you just mentioned before with Blur, right? Because that's exactly what that is. And then they wrap the NFT, and now you don't have the royalties anymore. And then say, oh no, now I can't make NFTs anymore. Well, I can, and I have to keep making them because the only way to make money. You mentioned about the standards. That is something that I think that is one of the most, you mentioned two things that are incredibly overlooked in this space. One is the amount of people and how problematic synchronous gameplay or anything that you need people together at the same time is hard to do because it's basically going to be empty because it's hardly 100,000 people who log in every day. But the other one is the standards, the tech stuff, like making standard, like just having assets from one game into another using the same engine from the same company. That's already hard. Now, if those things are created. So how do you see the steps and the layers technology-wise to move towards that direction? Do you think like, is there some kind of, because even Unity and Unreal couldn't solve that problem with the big games, right? They can't, and they have been trying to move towards that, because if there's one standard, one of them would basically win a lot and become super powerful, but they can't enforce that. How do you see that happening? Do you have any ideas around this on blockchain, this move towards standardization?
That's a good question. I mean, my take is that killer content tends to drive these things. I think like maybe these standards end up looking like which consoles were successful in the past, which is just that if somebody builds a great game and they can actually captivate people with it, then I think things can change fast. I mean, you guys saw that with what you did at Dapper with Top Shot, and we saw it with CryptoKitties. Like, I think we're one hit away on some of these. I'm a bit of an ETH maxi, but like really like if someone actually gets it right, we could be one hit away from some pretty big changes where people's attention are in terms of onboarding and everything else. And so with that could come standards, right? And it would be nice to see when that game comes, like if they do make progress and put up this sort of investment up front to think about this, that they're a little bit more forward thinking in terms of architecting it in a way that like it's sustainable. They're not trying to capture so much value from their position that they just build a system that people don't want to adopt. And I don't think we've seen that yet. Like I've been kind of a fan of Sandbox in some ways because I think they've really built a lot actually. If you look at the product, it's super impressive. But one of the things that always, and I know like, yeah, and the team are so forward thinking in terms of NFTs and, what they think the space can be. But then a lot of the metaphors in the game are still very much like Roblox in terms of like you make assets for Sandbox and like you create them in the Sandbox creator, and it's still to me seems like almost a little too stuck on the Web 2 model, or like creating assets that are specific for this platform. And so I just think the challenge is huge, and it's like one of the things we were trying to solve for Storyverse, but you got to crawl before you can walk, I guess. I mean, it's just there's so many assets out there, and there's a lot of hunger to do integrations, like get these characters from all these different PFP sets into a game, but the value is still kind of rolled up in a smaller portion of those. And then you have teams with like a lot of different skill sets in terms of are they just like an artist who just hand drew all this art, or are they somebody who's more technical and who can understand how to rig and animate it, and everything in between. And I guess what we might end up seeing is like some layers that, to your point, in the stack where like it mediates some of this. And it could be like on the licensing side, like what are you allowed to use? Can you use some of these characters or some of this IP in a game? And who gets paid if you do, if someone does get paid? There could be, what about the representation of that IP? Are there people who took that character and made sure that it was rigged and animated for use in Unity or in Unreal or in other game engines? I think all of that is still, like, in my mind, totally up for grabs. I think, as we know in this space, like only something that has economics that actually makes sense for everybody will stand the test of time. But first, somebody has to make something that works, and that always seems to be the hard part, right? So we're doing that by trying to focus on like one very specific vertical, and kind of like constraining the problem enough that we can solve it for some slice, and then maybe, you know, move adjacent from there and start rolling it out to other people. But I'm sure there are other good approaches too. I think it's really tough, but I do think another important part of the stack is going to be, you mentioned Unity and Unreal. I think it's going to be the game engine side. And I think what's tough about game engines right now is Unity and Unreal don't really export to web very well. And I think it's not an accident that we ended up calling this space Web3. I think this space really is about the web, and it's about taking power back from the app stores in some way. That's at least one thread here. That's a big part of it. And for game developers, this is especially tough because all the business happens in the app store. But Apple is not friendly to NFTs, and probably won't be, as long as they're not forced to change their policies. I don't think they will, because I think it's a pretty similar repeat to the story I mentioned with Facebook, which goes back 11 years in terms of them and their thinking around like alternative app stores. And they are finally, there are governments that are fighting with them about this now, but we're just getting to the very beginnings of those discussions. They're not talking about NFTs. They're talking about like the take rate and some very basic stuff compared to the NFT piece. So my take is like, probably games are going to have to be, if they really want to take full advantage of NFTs, they're going to have to be web-based. And I think there's more to that than the game engine. It's also just like the design. It's something that game developers haven't been focused on for a long time because the app stores have been where the money is. So I think that's been really challenging for a lot of teams, and that's also big. It's a big missing piece here.
You mentioned economics. I think it's the other missing piece too, because I think that in my experience, most like 99% of game devs don't understand free trading, and free market is something that can definitely ruin the economics of your game very easily. And it's very, very dangerous to use the models that we see in MMOs, or except for EVE, or free to play and all that, and just try to replicate them in blockchain. It doesn't work. And on that sense, you mentioned that the creation of content is something really important, and how we create it and how we translate this free creation on the blockchain from different types of people is, from my pure game designer perspective, the narratives, lore aspects of the game, they are the hardest stuff to put on chain. Basically, they are like very visual. They, as you said, you got to rig character, you got to do the animations, and it's very content heavy. On the other hand, you have the pure system side, which is way leaner, and it can live more on chain. So it can actually profit more from the value creation, the value distribution, the interoperability, the composability people build on top and all that, because it's very lean, right? What do you think about that? And that's what happened in DeFi to a certain extent. It's very simple systemic rules that got built upon indefinitely. Do you see something like that happening? Do you think that this is a path that when we develop a game, we should think about to lean more on these lean open systems that can be standardized for other people? Or do you think games are like really about, the lore and all that stuff?
That's a good question. I guess this gets to the heart of what you guys are working on. I mean, I think so much of one of the reasons I got fascinated with blockchain technology in the first place, to me, it's just like it's another human coordination technology. And in some ways, if you look at, it's almost like I know it helps people exchange value between people, of course, but if you think about social networking was like the last great sort of human communication technology. And then blockchain is kind of like this UI-less sequel to social networking in some ways, and it's complementary in a lot of interesting ways. And I think that the challenge is that a lot of it has been without UI, and that's been kind of its strength in the sense that it's agnostic. So it almost doesn't care where people are using it. And so we use Twitter, we use Discord, doesn't matter, because we've got this value layer that just exists wherever we want to use it. And I think that's been great for creators because they can just kind of take their fans and go wherever they want. And it actually has already armed an entire creative class of people with an answer to how to keep some of these bigger companies in check, which is really interesting. And I don't think it gets enough credit for that. So when it comes to game rules, I think that the challenge is like so much of what makes a game design work has been wrapped up in meticulous work on the sort of interface side for so long, and so much of it is about that experience that I think it's going to take some. I think you're right. Everything you said about like how you can put these things on chain in a way that's really powerful is 100% true. And then the question is like, how do you actually get someone to go build the experience on that that's going to go be the way that most normal people play? And I guess maybe that's my question for you, because that's what I'm really interested in. Like, if that's the future, is that kind of multiple people play or can experience different portals into the same game world, because the UI isn't there, or isn't developed by the original sort of developer. Like, how does that work?
Yeah, sometimes I call those client agnostic games, because it's the game is just a logic that's up there, and then people should be able to create clients to access the same rule set that provides some kind of, some people like to call it digital physics. I think it misdirects when you call it that. It's just a basic rule system that is immutable. And then from the interaction with that system, you get results, and then you can dress them up the way you want. But the question becomes, if it's just tit for tat, basically like stake, get 5% at each, month, it becomes this very basic thing. And then that building block's not interesting enough to properly create a game. But if you start to dress it up a lot, then you start to lean too much on the interface, because that's the reflex that we have, right? Of lean on the interface. It's almost like we're trying to make a movie, and it's just like we have been making movies, but now we have to write, a podcast that tells a story. So like, forget the image. It's like, oh my God, but it's what I do with movies. They're all about image. No. Now you only have dialogues. Good luck. So it's very, I love the challenge, actually.
Is there a certain type of game you think is going to be, I mean, I know you've thought a ton about it, but like what types of games do you think are going to be great for this?
more system games. I 100% agree with the point that you said, that like games have to be more asynchronous, that you have to be able to play at any time and still feel connected and see the reflections of other people's touch into the world that you share. So I think 4X is a very good one, something in that like kind of, you know, empire building, stuff like that. The main issue with that one is usually that people just copy, you know, Civ or some other RTS, you know, mechanics, and that economy is just hyperinflationary. It's not properly balanced within itself. There are not enough sinks, so it's just it's like that book, Growth, you know. It's just like it grows like geometrically, and then there's just too much abundance and nothing works. But I feel that these kind of games, more in the 4X and empire building, are probably the most interesting ones. But some very distilled, very distilled version of those mechanics.
Yeah, it reminds me of this this conversation I had recently with somebody who was, a lot of people have used the Minecraft engine because it's open source, right? And there was a project called NFT Worlds, which changed its name, which was using the Minecraft engine and integrating NFTs into it. They were doing really well for a while. But I recently heard somebody else who was actually taking a slightly different approach, where they actually built a tool to take existing Minecraft worlds and import them into their own game, which wasn't Minecraft, which I hadn't seen somebody do before. And so they could easily go to all these creators and say, like, hey, it turns out that thing you made a YouTube video on, you know, for 24 hours or whatever it was, you can just drop that into our game and it looks better than Minecraft. And, you know, maybe there's even some incentives for like telling people about it over here, because we'll do things that Minecraft's not doing. But it got me thinking, when you talk about 4X games, some of them have like these, just the most hardcore audiences ever, right? And when I start thinking about how to bring people over, like, who are the reason 4X clicked with me is like, maybe this is something that they actually want, right? Because I think they're so hardcore that they might actually care about the sort of permanence of the rule set in some way, where like they can count on it for a long time. And I wonder if there's even a way to get an existing community excited about kind of coming over for like an open source alternative that they feel like they won't get rugged on, because I'm sure a lot of them have dealt with that before.
Yeah, I believe one of the most primed or possible communities to actually understand and have fun on a blockchain game, and also understand the possibility of creation that they have, is the EVE Online player community, because they do all that. They create beyond the game, you know. One of the jokes is that if you're a really good EVE player, it's unbecoming to log into the server. So they don't like to play, like to fly the ships, because they don't have to, and they're still playing the game. And I think that's when I got the idea of client agnostic games, right? Because like you don't have to have a client to play the game. But the issue comes a lot with cultural wars kind of thing, because so many people hate NFTs. It's kind of a damned word, like especially with hardcore gamers. Because one thing that we may believe, and we think that like most of us are gamers here, and we really think that we are really avant-garde and all that, but this is a huge exception. The majority of gamers are extremely conservative. They are probably the most conservative people in tech ever. I think you can imagine, right? Like when Zynga was doing all those free-to-play things, the people who identified themselves as gamers would turn their nose and say, this is not a game, this is all these things, this is free, as you said, right? This is microtransactions are you know, the devil and all that. And still, so many people who play hours and hours of simple games, they don't identify themselves as gamers, because they just, oh no, I only play Wordle. Like, no, that's a game. You're a gamer, right? Don't pretend you're not. So I worry about, I think even though they are perfect for it, they don't, culturally, they are not gonna want to mix up with these things. But again, I think that also that's another issue that there is in the blockchain, is that because it has so much money, it tries to grow too fast. The promise of the audience tries to follow the promise of the money growth, and then it tries to give a step longer than its own legs, and it trips. AR has the opposite problem. AR VR has the opposite problem. It grows too slow. So yeah, I think that there's less people, basically. Sorry, I said a lot. Does that make any sense to you, Justin?
No, yeah, I agree. I think that this is it gets me coming back to this idea of free, which is there are people who don't like. There's a lot of people who don't like NFTs, and I think one of the number one concerns I usually hear from people in games is they hear like this thing about people selling an NFT for $69 million, and then they hear they have this experience where like they have these virtual items that were in these games that now they're like, hey, I have to pay over here, and they're thinking, why on earth would I want to spend more money on the same game? And I actually think that that's like not what it's going to be in the long run. They're going to realize the economics like they did with freemium, where even if you just imagine like this world where we just flip a switch and like all the freemium purchases were happening in NFTs suddenly, and no one knew. And then one day we just told them tomorrow is like NFT day. Turns out everything you ever bought in the App Store, now you can sell it if you're done with it, you don't want anymore. The prices are going to go down for everything, for sure. But suddenly like all these people get money back. And you know, there's 130 billion every year spent toward developers that they don't get a penny back for. And if some developer just starts teaching them that like, yeah, it's okay, you can just, you know, quit our game and get half your money back after you spent $10,000, and like people are going to start to switch to that. And it won't be everybody at once. It'll be like, you know, the people who get it, and then they'll tell other people, and it'll be a similar thing that happens with freemium, where they're like, actually, freemium was a better value than these console games because I didn't have to pay up front. I wasn't taking a risk. And then now they're going to start to see, well, blockchain games are actually a better value than freemium because I get half my money back when I'm done playing. There's no play to earn. It's just, it's like skiing or any other hobby, right? Like you're done with a thing, you get a new one, you sell the old one, get some money toward the next thing. And in that interesting way, like the net spend on games could go way up because suddenly these people who are sort of spending their max amount of money they can spend on entertainment a month have more money to spend because they can actually sell these virtual goods back to spend into the next game, which is really interesting. And I think that that'll happen over time. It's going to take time for people to understand that piece of it, and like more people need to help educate them on that. But a big part of this is like, if it's not free up front, then it invites a lot of scrutiny, right? And so I do think if you think about the best possible way to grow a game very quickly, it's going to be making it free. And people talk about the on-ramp in terms of the wallet, but they often skip the part about like the upfront cost. And the upfront cost is like perhaps even more relevant to most people. But it's okay for us to create ecosystems where like these people aren't all having the full experience. And so you mentioned EVE Online. I don't know what the free experience could be for something like that, but you can imagine like there's tons of people playing this free game where they never touch an NFT, or they're just touching a bunch of really cheap free NFTs. And it's somehow playing into this broader battle between the people who are actually playing with all these assets, right? That are worth something. And to me, that just seems like where it has to go, because most people just can't afford anything otherwise, right? So if the real mission is to go make a game that like 1 billion people can play, it has to be mostly free. And I think one of the things that probably won't happen, that a lot of people seem to be excited about, is like the ARPDAU numbers, or like average revenue per DAU, something. If you look at it compared to games off in Web 2, it looks so high in blockchain, but it's also so strongly self-selected for this crowd that's been made a lot of gains in this space. And it's not as if like somebody else you bring into this space suddenly has more purchasing power because they're on a blockchain. That doesn't happen, right? I mean, if I can spend $500 a month on games, I can spend it on non-blockchain or blockchain. And if you move me, I can't spend any more now that I'm in Web3. And I think a lot of people, this is a very simple concept, so it sounds ridiculous to even say, but this is a type of mental gymnastics that I think a lot of people are doing in the space, where they sometimes think that like a Web3 user is just worth more, but they're not. It's just the same person, right? And so, but that's okay, because like this could be a much more competitive way and much more interesting way to get more people involved who are tired of playing the same shit over and over on the App Store, right? So like the question is like, how do you use blockchain to make something more interesting? And then without sacrificing accessibility, of course, and realizing that like the economics get more and more like a freemium game, but the more they do, the more you have to compete in the same channels, which is the thing that gets challenging. Like, how are you going to outcompete these games in the place where they've been advertising for 10 years? And this is where I think the fact that Apple is now kneecapping Facebook is actually pretty good timing. And in many ways, like the fact that Web3 has been an outcast in terms of being able to run performance marketing from the beginning has helped it, right? It's gotten really good at community marketing and other tactics that a lot of the Web2 game companies weren't using. But in order to get to scale, we need something scalable, right? So I do think someone has to crack performance marketing or whatever's left of it. I do think people have to crack those channels, because that's the only way you can get in front of this many people right now.
Oh yeah, marketing channels are tough. And you would be surprised how many educated people actually believe that, yeah, people would spend $10,000 a month on NFTs and you could grow that audience to 100 million people. You would be surprised that there's people that follow that logic too far. There's one thing on the economy side that I agree with most of what you said. The economy side is the only part that I get a little bit that I have some, how can I say, reticence to agree, is that as you have this huge influx of players and they build or buy items in the game, digital goods, and then they can freely dispose of them to other players. This is something that has never happened in the free-to-play. And this is something that would, if it happens, it would just mean that the game, the developer would not make a single cent probably for the next 2 or 3 years until everybody, because those things get redistributed, but they don't tear down, they are not worn down, they don't change, they're still 100% useful. And now, why would I buy from the game? I'm gonna buy from other players, and that thing just gets recycled forever, unless it grows forever in the number of users. So there's always some kind of increase in demand, but that's also how a pyramid works. So we don't want to get there. So yeah, that's the only issue that you got to make shit break.
Yeah. This is like the fundamental problem right now, right? So I saw a clear path with what Gabe was doing on the free NFT side, because you could give away free NFTs, and as long as people are trading, you could take some small cut of that, and you could go build. And when that went away, now you make money from the issuance and selling of issuance of NFTs, right? So it does create a bit of a puzzle and how these things are going to work. So I think it is possible probably for certain game economies to demand a certain level of tax within their economy and have it like hold up for a bit longer, but it doesn't feel like the sort of perfect solution here. So yeah, I'm curious, like it seems like you need kind of multiple connected but sort of separate economies that somehow affect each other in a way where you can preserve some of the scarcity. But yeah, I'm sure you guys have probably done more thinking about that than I have.
Oh, I've been thinking about that since I was working at EVE Online. So it's been like 7-8 years now. But that's exactly, and that's just to connect back to the question I made you earlier, right? I think that is the core issue of the business model that we have to solve for crypto games, that is going to be tightly connected to the way we design the games in this space. Just like there are ways that we design free-to-play games because it's tied to the way it monetizes, right? There is gonna be this connection. The way we design MMOs because it's connected to the subscription. You know, there is gonna be a piece there, but I don't think that answer is done yet, and it's up to us to figure out. And I think it's a great question to try to answer.
Do you imagine for some of these games as they become more interoperable, like autonomous worlds, for them to be sort of like separate creators who permissionlessly are building on like a previous game concept and even maybe reusing like the interface layer or the client, as you put it, like but changing the game rules and sort of building like a quasi sequel or a mod at the blockchain level?
Oh yes, I think that mods is at this point, the way I think about it, mods is the best thing that I can think of. I see that the initial games should be as simple as possible. Today, you look at the biggest games out there, at like large games, right? AAA big games, they're all mods. Counter-Strike is a mod. Any MOBA is basically a mod. Fortnite is a copy of a mod. So it's all mods, and I think that simpler, when the source engine came out that allowed for Counter-Strike, right? The source engine was way better than Half-Life. It changed way more stuff, right? And it allowed for Fortnite, allowed also for the Team Fortress that was also a mod. So you know, all these things come up. So if we make simpler rules now, more basic, leave spaces open, I believe that these mods are going to be built on top of the original economy or the original game that can actually get way more users or create its own community, like, you know, blossoming out of it. And I think that that's the most powerful thing, because people are going to be invested in the underlying technology or the underlying game too, even if they just play that smaller, you know, version of that's the one they like. And yeah, the tricky thing is how to connect all of them. And again, I think all of this, if we think about it in systems, it's hard enough. If we try to think about it in systems and interface, then we're basically fucked. I don't think we can solve for everything at the same time. So it's accepting that. That's why I believe everything should be on chain, because at this point you're client agnostic, and then you don't have to really refer or make any kind of node. You can create a completely different visual and all that, as long as the systems and the economy is underlying, is properly connected. Then, you know, oh, you made a space game, now I make a, you know, medieval game on top of a space game that uses the same economy, but I have my own laws completely different, even though the resources that are coming are the same if you look at the blockchain stuff. So yeah, I know it's weird, but I don't know. We eventually get there, hopefully.
No, I could see it. It seems to be like the games get smaller, right? In some sense, because everyone's just building kind of their remix of it, and you end up like having an ecosystem of a lot of similar games where players are kind of popping in and out of them, and maybe playing multiple, maybe not. Maybe enjoying like this type of game and participating in several, where they can share some resources. Does it get that wacky, or?
I don't know, dude. Hopefully.
Yeah, well, because the interesting thing about it is like one of the biggest challenges I've been trying to wrap my head around in games is like the half-life of content just keeps getting shorter, right? And even Diablo 4, like we're not going to be talking about it next week. You know, it's kind of sad. No matter how much money you spend on a game, you still have as much like sort of time in the sun as like some YouTuber's new video about like a squirrel in his backyard. And I think that's just where the internet has gone. And so one thing that's kind of cool about the autonomous worlds model, or just interoperability in general, is like you can almost imagine if the games get cheap enough to make, then you get this thing where it's relevant because it's new, and it's okay if it only gets its couple weeks in the sun because it wasn't developed with hundreds of millions of dollars or tens of millions of marketing. It's a smaller shot on goal. That's an iteration of the hundreds of games that have come before it. And to me, that feels sort of sustainable. That's like a lot of what this space has been about, and the art side and what's kind of working in NFTs. There's like lots of sort of constant, it's like a big open game of improv, right? Where people are doing things and they're just sort of like riffing off of each other. And there's these metas that form. And yeah, I can imagine games working a lot more similarly to that. Like I worry when I see games coming into the space that are sort of, their plan is to go build something for 2 years and release it. It just seems, at least with the way the ecosystem is right now, it just seems really hard to pull that off. So if nothing else, like I'd love to, I mean, that's exciting to me if I'm understanding it right. Like the idea that like games could just become way more pervasive in Ethereum because so many people can build off of similar elements. I think we'll see so much interesting experimentation.
Yeah, there's this democratization. I think the point is the democratization of the building side, right? And it's a tendency of the internet, because I'm old enough to remember a time when there was no internet, and the only people who could, you know, broadcast videos were people who had a huge antenna. They were called broadcasters, and they had to pay the government. They had to get a license from the government. So, you know, there were pirate radios that, you know, but that's how you broadcast thing. And then the internet came, and then like, oh, any receptor, it's like basically anyone who has a TV set can actually put on a show. And that's literally what happens now with YouTube, right? And it just democratizes the content of creation. And now we have the democratization, and then the platforms start to hold, you know, to stranglehold that. And now it's, oh, anybody can create, but everybody has to go through YouTube or through Instagram or TikTok or whatever. Now it's like, no, there's no platform. And even if you say, oh, they have to go through my game, if the game is fully on chain and everything is on chain, now you can't control it. People can just deploy on top of your game. Like people can mod your game without you having any control about it, and they can monetize on top of it. I think that that's really, really cool. And then you can actually just let the game go and it becomes truly autonomous, because now it's like, no, I'm not going to be making the OG original version anymore. It's kind of, you know, it's out there. I stopped. Now people make it over and over, right? The danger is that it can die. And the other danger is that it's so easy to clone. That's another thing that I think is a little bit, could be kind of like the Blur move, kind of to rug everyone who's super, you know, because you can just clone it, or you can just kind of vampire attack by look, oh, I got this thing, and like I got all this money from this big VC, and I'm going to be doing for like $120 million. And now you play this game X, I'm cloning your wallet, and everything that you have in the game is here. I made the same game, but it looks better, and it's 3D, and, you know, it has whatever graphics and all that stuff.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot like the right-click save as that was happening in art NFTs, right? I mean, I think, look, the interesting, realistically speaking, like all of this is so good for consumers in the long run, right? Like they don't own any of this stuff. They're going to own it. They're going to get to sell it. We're going to have to design an economy that makes like game developers actually make money, and whatever rules inevitably end up kind of being where we land here. But it's good for players, and like that whole trend of games getting cheaper for the last 30 years, I wouldn't bet against that. Like I think it's just going to continue to happen, and it could be through some of the ways we talked about today. Like the fact that people can actually go and sell back the stuff they own now is a way of games getting even cheaper than they are in the App Store. And even when it comes to the creation side, like just the stuff that you're talking about, to me, it just gets my head spinning. It's got a lot of overlap with what we've been thinking about on the Storyverse side. But I do feel like all these other forms of media have become so cheap to create, and games are next. And like the implications of that are just going to be huge, and really good for people like us who are in this ecosystem. We're trying to figure it out, and really exciting, and probably, like, to be completely honest, just really bad time to be a big studio. I think the AI and everything that's panned out, it's like the leverage that's been delivered into the hands of everybody right now is unbelievable and completely different than me or anybody else seemed to think 6 months ago, where there were going to be 3 or 4 companies that were going to have these amazing tools that nobody else got. It's like they're all free, or it's $20 a month, and everybody has access. The open source community is just blowing up with them. I think I just think that in the next couple of years, we're just going to see a lot of really interesting game content being made by 1, 2, 3-person teams. And I think when you think about like where to publish in a place where the economics work out, I think like Ethereum or, you know, the blockchain is the place. Like maybe games start looking a lot more like art, because that's after all, like pretty much what they are. And you could have a vision for something you want to make over the weekend and actually get it done and make it worth your time. And sometimes you end up like people, you make $69 million, and sometimes you make $50. But if the economics around the creation side change, that's okay. And, and I don't know, maybe I'm getting a bit ahead of myself here, but like, I do feel like the same things we've seen happen with music and movies, like it feels like it's finally going to happen to games. And I think that's mostly a good thing. And I think like what you guys are working on is definitely at the center of that.
I hope you're right. I think you're right too. And I agree. It's a bad time to be a big studio. I used to be in one 9 months ago, and I didn't like it. There is a point too that you said like about the content creation. Like we didn't even discuss it, but it's on the client side, the interface side, like AI, right? It changes so much the cost of content creation. That is actually the biggest barrier. And yeah, it's another thing that's going to help a lot, the creation, the development of the games and I think that just reinforces the point of being like, oh no, games should be like, you know, client agnostic, because creating a client can be such a fun way to express yourself. And yeah, I think it's cool, and it's going to be cheaper. Yeah.
On that note, we're at time, but thank you, Justin. Thank you, Raph, for like the great conversation. Hope everyone enjoyed this.
Thanks, everybody. Hopefully I get to stop by sometime when you guys are like doing demos or something. I'm really curious to see some stuff. So I'll be back.
Please. And by the way, Peter and I in Lisbon, so if you want to show up anytime.
Yeah, come hang out.
Will do. All right, guys.
Thanks,
Have a
everyone.
good one. Thanks, everybody.